Well, hey everyone, Hudson Henry here, and this is a kind of a quick hit tips and tricks video for those of you who have a Nikon Z camera. I'm working with the Z6 here, but all the controls are going to be identical between the two cameras. They have the same menu system, they have the same controls, they're essentially the same body and camera with two different sensors. And I'm just going to talk, this is mainly for those of you who already have one and you want to know maybe how to set it up a little bit more efficiently for your shooting style, and some tips and tricks about setting it up and using the custom settings and changing the controls around to just make it the optimum for shooting. You know, I tend to be a landscape and travel photographer, but I also love to shoot wildlife, street scenes, sports, and action. So I'll talk a little bit about how I have this thing set up, and you can adapt it to your own workflow however you want. One thing that's really important is, you know, it has these little user settings, the U1, U2, U3 along here on the top dial. And I would argue that you want to go through and set those overall control settings that you'd like to have in every single different user setting before you adjust those. If you've already adjusted those and you're going to go through and change the way the controls work for the buttons and remap the buttons at all, just remember that those are going to get mapped, and you know those won't be programmed in unless you reprogram the user buttons after you've set them. So I'd argue set up some of these basic settings that you want all the time, and then locking your user settings with the changes that you'd like specific to each of those user settings. So for example, I have my user settings set up kind of one for landscape, one for silent shooting if I was in an event and I wanted to just not be disruptive with the shutter sound. And then the third one is more for sports and action oriented, which I would in general avoid photographing with this camera. That's another note. I did 3 videos on this. One is just sort of my general impressions of this camera, things that I love about it, things that are disappointing about it. Overall, there's more to love than not love in my particular case as I come to this, you know, being that it's not my only camera. I have other cameras for sports and action and wildlife that do a little bit better job autofocusing in the burst mode, but for me, low light video and low light image quality and time lapse is really pretty phenomenal with this camera. I really enjoy carrying it around in low light situations. So there's another video on my raves and rants about this that's linked down below. Also, I have one of my every Thursday series of videos, my Approaching the Scenes video, where I talk with an amazing filmmaker friend of mine, Andy Atkins, about his impressions of the camera from a filmmaker's perspective. So those other videos are out there. This is really focused for those people who have it and want to adjust the settings and see how I have my settings set up. I'll go through my menu settings, what I have in there and why, and I'll talk about some just overall settings that I want always, and also how I have my user settings set up a bit. So there you go. So I'm going to go in, and how I customize the controls on the camera. So one thing I always do with each and every one of my cameras is I get the focus, autofocus off of the shutter button. I want the autofocus to hit this nice little AF on button that's so nicely laid out and fits to your thumb just perfect on this camera. I want to be able to shoot with one finger and turn autofocus on and off with the other. So I'm going to go into my custom setting menu here, the pencil setting, and I'm going to run down to autofocus, A, and the first thing I want to do is go down to this autofocus activation, and I want that to be AF on only. I don't want it on the shutter. And then when I go into the subsetting of that, I want it to be able to release. I want to be able to click the shutter even if things don't appear to be in focus. You know, let's think maybe I recomposed and the focus point isn't over a focused portion of the scene. I want to be able to make a decision about taking a picture even if the autofocus point isn't on something that's in focus. So I click enable on that. Boom, that setting is locked in. Another setting I like to have all the time set just by default to on in here is focus points used. One of the things that's a little bit annoying with this camera is it has a lot of focus points clear across the whole sensor, and the Z7 has even more, like double as many. And it takes a little bit of time to use the joystick controller to scroll from the middle to the extreme edge, and I like to have it just skip every other point. So instead of using all points, I put every other point in here. Now this is one of the settings that I put in my menu. I'll show you later so that you can flip back if you want that fine tunability, if it's really important for you to be anywhere that you want specifically on the screen. But this is going to speed up your ability to get to the part of the image that you want in focus by using every other point. So I want that to be the default. Then I want to go into controls. And one thing to keep in mind is that this camera has a switch between video and still. So you got a camera setting and a video setting, and you have different control settings for both. It's going to remember everything that you did the last time you were taking stills. After you flip to video, it's going to remember everything you were doing in video the last time and put you right back where you were when you were filming video the last time. And then when you flip back to stills, it remembers your settings. It's really nice. That's an advancement for a Nikon camera, being able to remember exactly how the camera was set up when you were filming video as opposed to shooting stills. That's something they needed to do for a long time, and I'm really happy to see it. It's one of the things I love about this. And you have different control settings under the F part of the custom menu in controls and the G part of the custom setting menus movie. So I'll show you how that works. So we go on into controls, and one thing you can customize is this I menu. When you hit the I button on the back of the camera, this is going to flash up whenever you're photographing. And I like to have the following settings in here. You can click any one of these. You can scroll around here when you're in the F1 section, and you can choose from a whole plethora of different settings to put in there to suit your particular needs. I'm going to hit the little back button. Remember, this is a touch screen, so we can always jump through and just touch anything we want on the screen. Same as in menus as in focus points. It's pretty great. So the way I have it set up, I have long exposure noise reduction. I have ISO noise reduction. I might want to turn those off and on depending on whether maybe I'm doing a time lapse of stars and I don't want to have the gap with noise reduction, or star trails, or different situations where I might not want that noise reduction. So I have it both for long exposure and ISO. I have image quality. I often want to flip image quality plus a JPEG if I want to be able to share a JPEG really quick, maybe have it automatically transferred to my phone via SnapBridge. One of the ways that I kind of turn that on and off is just by flipping from only shooting a raw image to raw plus some size of JPEG. Meanwhile, I can choose what size of JPEG I'm creating if I am doing JPEGs. White balance, that's something I want to shift around from time to time. Usually I run on auto, but there's times, let's say I'm photographing a panorama, it's a nice thing to just set it to all the same white balance, keep everything locked in. Metering mode, one thing that's missing on this camera is the ability to just hit a button and change metering, so it's good to put it in the I menu so you have access if you want to switch from matrix or what Canon shooters would think of as evaluative metering into center weighted or spot metering. Vibration reduction, that's something that you want to turn on, potentially if you're hand holding and you're going to have a little bit slower shutter speed and you're worried about camera shake. It's just going to add a whole lot of extra stops of hand holdability to the camera. It has a really good vibration reduction built into the body. And it's one of the other exciting things about this camera is that using this FTZ adapter, you can adapt old legacy lenses that don't have vibration reduction into this body that has it built into the body. We have in-body image stabilization, IBIS, which is great. Exposure delay mode. This is a mode where if you don't have a cable release with you and you want to do a long exposure on the tripod, you can set this to a bunch of different settings, from 0.2 of a second, I think, to half a second to a second to 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And what it does is it lifts, well, you don't have a mirror. It just delays it for a second. If you have an SLR, it lifts the mirror, and then it opens and closes the shutter the time after you tell it to. In this case, it's going to just wait till you move your hand away from the camera, open and close the shutter, and capture the image. We've got flash control mode. Now this doesn't have a built-in flash, but it will control the Nikon SB5000 wireless flash, which is something I've really been enjoying, the shift to the wireless flash. It costs a little money to get into that system with the radio frequency versus the old onboard flash controlled creative lighting system, but it's really nice to be able to trigger it from around corners and at great distances. And this is going to let you control the output of a whole series of flashes remotely. Wi-Fi connection, that's nice if you're going to be connecting to a smartphone app, say for time-lapse photography. I often use QDSLR, and I can monitor what the images look like and control exposure without touching the camera and changing the settings or stopping the time-lapse, so you can do things like day to night transitions. Your focus modes, got those set up right here as well. So that's how I have my still photography iMenu setup. You can customize that to taste. Any of this is changeable. Custom control assignment. That's all the buttons around the camera, and I'll show you how I have mine set up. So I have on the front this middle finger button right here that just falls under your middle finger when you're holding the grip. I have depth of field preview, and that's really important with this camera because, you know, as I talk about in my rants and raves video, one of my major rants with this is in still mode, when you're not in video mode, when you're in still photography mode, it doesn't stop down smaller than f5.6 when you're live viewing what the sensor's seeing. It keeps that sensor having a bright image at lower ISO, which is nice, but you don't see the depth of field unless you hit this preview button. And one big change I'd like Nikon to make is to make that a lockable depth of field preview so that I can work with the camera and change ISO and not hold my finger down on that button. That's a real frustration for me. And a change from the DSLRs that by default showed you exactly the aperture that you'd chosen, no matter how small it is, and it would just boost ISO and get a little grainy in low light conditions. And then the depth of field preview button would lock it open, wide open with a symbol on the back of the camera, and then you touch it again and it stops back down to your given aperture, but the default is to show you what you want. And I like that better. So my little rant built in here too. And again, that video is linked down below here on YouTube, my raves and rants. That's a major rant. Bracketing, there's no dedicated bracketing button, so I want that here. That is that button that falls to my right ring finger. When I've got the grip in my hand, it's right there at the tip of my finger, and I can change bracketing with the dials on the top holding that button down. Autofocus on, I definitely want to be autofocus on. I've taken it off the shutter. The joystick, I want to control the location of the focus points. Pressing the center of the joystick, I want to center those focus points so I can jump to the middle just by pressing. And that's going to get you quicker from right to left, from the center. It lets you move around faster. Movie record button. This is a really nice thing. When you're in still mode, the movie record button won't work to record movies. You've got to be in movie mode. So they let you map that to another function, and I have that again set to the autofocus modes. So when I hold that down, I can change autofocus modes with the back dial, and I can change the autofocus point selection with the front dial. Really, really nice. And then if you have buttons on your lenses, some lenses do, if you have buttons on your lenses, you can set it up. Here I have autofocus lock, auto exposure lock, and the focus ring to do focusing. There are different choices than focusing you can do, like aperture control or exposure compensation. I like it to be the manual focus ring, but that's something you can choose. And you could set differently in the different U menus. Again, any of these settings that you change will get locked in if you save one of your user control settings. So it's a good thing to get this all dialed before you lock in those user control settings, or else you're going to have to redo it on every single one of them. Okay, jumping back out, we have the OK button. This is another really important one. When we jump into that, I like it to magnify the view, whether I'm looking through the viewfinder or looking at the back LCD, to 100%. And the way I do that is I choose it in shooting mode. It's going to zoom on and off, and it's going to go 1-to-1, 100% magnification. So by hitting that OK button in the middle of that back D-pad, it's going to just zoom to 100%. And I think that's really important because Nikon didn't provide us, this is another one of my rants, with the functionality of just when we touch the focus on a lens with electronic contacts, that it just automatically zooms in on our chosen focus point. That's usually, with most mirrorless cameras that I've used, an option that if you touch the focus ring, it just does focus assist where it jumps into 100% view on your focus point. Not so with this. So I have this set so that I can do that by pressing the OK button, then manually focus, then press the OK button to come out to the full compositional view again. So there you go. That's an important setting. I also like it to be the same exact setting in playback mode. So I want to go into playback mode and do the zoom on, off, 100% magnification. It's just nice to check focus really quick on the focus point that you worked. And that's essentially the only settings that I really change for camera controls. Bumping back out, I go into the movie modes. We have all those same choices. So movies, I have something a little bit different. It's really important with video that you get the picture control set up right. I tend to like to shoot movies with this camera if I'm shooting internally and not using one of the 10-bit, say, Nikon log settings with an external recorder like an Atomos Ninja that I have. If I'm shooting internally to the card and it's 8-bit compression, I want to use the flat picture profile. For me, that gives me the best ability to capture highlight and shadow and have some ability to tweak it later in post-production and get a nice look. you should test out these different picture control settings for video to see which one you like best. But flat's one I would suggest. It requires a little bit of tweaking afterwards to get looking just right, but it gives you more latitude to do that. White balance is really important in video, just like it is photographing JPEGs. If you get it wrong, it's really hard to change in post-production. I like my movie quality settings to be right here, so I can change whether it's 4K, 1080, how many frames per second. I generally shoot most things in 4K at 24 frames a second for a nice filmic look. Microphone sensitivity, I use a lot of external microphones, and I watch the gauges and get it right to where it's just shy of peaking using that gauge. And I can listen with headphones to make sure I've got it just right and monitor. One nice thing about this is a good dedicated inline and headphone line to monitor. Choosing an image area, whether it's full frame or compact sensor, this is a really nice thing with video because it can actually crop in on the lens and you're still filming in 4K, but you've got more reach with a long lens. So suddenly a 100 millimeter lens might look like a 150 millimeter lens's view of the world. Metering. Metering is, again, it's just like in stills, it's nice to be able to choose what metering style you're using. The Wi-Fi connection, again, same thing. I might want to be connected to an external Wi-Fi application. Active D-lighting, that's the same thing it does in JPEG mode. It's just going to boost shadow detail a little bit. It's fun to just play with that a little bit. You got to be careful and look at what it does to the image quality with video, but it's an interesting setting. Whether you use electronic vibration reduction, that's just actually moving the pixels around in the film frame to get a little extra vibration reduction, something to play with if you're really working with something that's like you're shooting off a motorcycle or in a sporting situation or out of a car. Handheld vibration reduction I generally leave on. It's pretty amazing in video. Autofocus area mode, autofocus controls once again. When it comes to the custom control assignment, I've got the white balance button just so that I don't even have to go into that menu. I can shift white balance if I see a problem while I'm looking through the viewfinder filming video. And the lower button, that one that comes to the ring finger on the right hand while you're holding the grip, I've got the different autofocus settings, just like I have on the movie record button in still mode. AF on is AF on, just like in still photography. Everything else is pretty close to the same. You don't have a control over what that joystick does. It's always going to be selecting focus points, but pressing it can reset to the center the same way it does in still photography. The shutter button for the camera will record stills. I've got it set to just record stills. You have other options that you can do with it, but it's nice to be able to capture a still while you're filming video. And once again, autofocus on the ring of a lens. So those, the same thing too, I want the OK button to do the zooming on and off. So, once again, I got 100% magnification as a choice, and that's going to let me just zoom in and see exactly what I want. Another setting in here is autofocus speed. I'm finding that it's a little bit sort of slow and shifting. Let's say you want to rack from one person's face to another person's face in a video setting. I'm liking it just a little bit faster than center, so I have it at a +2 setting. You can play around with these settings, but it controls how fast the focus shifts. So just an interesting setting to play around with. And autofocus tracking sensitivity, I'm finding I like about a +2 on that. That's just my settings right now. So then if you wonder what I set up in my user mode, so it's the kind of things that you're going to want in different shooting situations. My user 1 mode, I have exposure delay turned on for 1 second so that it gives me a little bit longer, it gives me a less chance of having camera shake in low light landscape situations. It's all sort of set up for landscape. It's going to be noise reduction turned off because I'm going to do that in post-production. I'd rather do it myself really, really carefully in post-production. It's just, a whole bunch of things I would want for landscape, but it has all these base settings cooked in that we've already changed. U2 is a silent shooting mode. It's nice for situations where you want to be surreptitious about your shooting. You can maybe pull this screen up and look like you're fiddling with the camera and silently be shooting photos, or you're working, say, an event or a wedding and you don't want to have that sound of that shutter slap disturbing what's happening. U3 mode for me is more settings that I would use for sports and wildlife. It's continuous autofocus tracking, dynamic mode. It's faster shutter speed and shutter priority mode is the setting, because I'm really caring about making sure that I freeze or blur motion depending on what I want. It's those kinds of things I would use if I'm stuck shooting sports in action with this camera, which I don't think does very good burst tracking. It does a great job catching a subject and moving with it, but you can get the first frame really nice if you're selective, but then the continuous burst, you tend to lose the ability to track the focus as it's taken subsequent photos. That's my experience, at least. So the other thing I want to talk about before I wrap this tips and tricks video is the My Menu settings. What do I have in My Menu? Well, the things I set up in here are exposure delay mode. You know, I probably don't need that since it's in the I menu, but it's something I've had on all my DSLRs forever and ever, and I just like it to be sitting at the top. I want to be able to flip it on and flip it off if I want to basically act as if I have a cable release when I don't. Clean image sensor. This camera has, you know, nothing between the sensor and the air when you take the lens off. So all the mirrorless cameras I've worked with, the sensors get dirty really quickly. So the ability to remember to just hold it upside down and hit that clean image sensor, it shakes and gets rid of some of the dust. Long exposure noise reduction, something I want to turn on and off pretty frequently. Format the memory card. One of the bummers with this camera is it doesn't have a 2-button press. Other cameras have that kind of nuclear option where you do a 2-button press on my Nikon D850 or my Nikon D500 or any of my Nikon cameras, and it'll ask you if you want to format the card, and you have to hit them both simultaneously again, and it'll just format and get rid of everything on the card. You know, it's like having to have 2 keys to authorize the launch code for a nuclear missile. You're going to nuke all of the photos on your card. But it's nice to just be able to hold that down for a couple seconds, tap it again, and it's formatted. So instead I've put that in my menu because I want access to it. And every time you put a card in after downloading the computer and backing up, it's a good idea to format the card. It just kind of reconditions it. It rejuvenates it. It's less likely to get, you know, clutter in there and lost data bits. Interval timer shooting. This is for time lapse. I use it all the time. Monitor brightness. If I'm out photographing the Milky Way, I want that thing really dim. If I'm out at high noon, I want it really bright, so I want easy access to that. Focus shift shooting. Something I'm so happy to see in the Z cameras, that's in the Nikon D850, and I use it all the time. You get into situations where hyperfocal distance won't cut it for capturing everything in focus in the scene that you want in focus. So you just focus on the closest object, tell it how many frames you want it to take, tell it what distance apart, and I find in landscapes, you know, 20 and a step of 5 works really, really great. You want a smaller step if you're doing macro photography and more images, but you can easily blend those to get everything in the scene in focus. It works really, really well. I have a course all about that I'm about to drop, so keep your eyes out for that. And that's for both people that have this camera and for people that don't have this camera. I'll talk about different ways of capturing those images. Exposure value steps for exposure control. That's a thing when I'm doing long exposures in particular. I'll get the exposure dialed in that I want, slap, say, a 10-stop neutral density on there, flip this from being 1/3 of a step exposure control to a full step exposure control, and just click the dial 10 steps back to get that exposure right. Because often you have a little trouble metering with heavy neutral density, and this just lets you move around faster when you're moving a lot of stops. You know, it's for what it's worth. I often shift it and shift it back. Silent photography, again, the ability to flip into that silent mode if you just don't want to be obnoxious with the sound of the shutter slap. Electronic front curtain shutter, you know, that's something I always left turned on with the Nikon DSLRs, but it's also something that they would only work with when it was you doing live view shooting and in situations where you're unlikely to be capturing fast action. With the mirrorless camera, it could do it all the time, and if you're capturing fast action with electronic front curtain shutter, you can get weird, kind of warpy, like rolling shutter with stills. You'll get a bust that looks like it's shaped like a U as it's moving through the scene. It's something you don't want turned on for high shutter speeds. It's a good thing when you're doing slow shutter speeds. Self-timer, nice to be able to adjust how many frames it's taking, what the distance between, the time between each shot is. Peaking highlights, you can control the intensity. I find that the normal setting with peaking highlights on this is really, really subtle and nice and helpful, and not a little bit obnoxious and distracting like I find it to be with the Sony's set to low. So normal's what I've been running, and I really like the focus peaking in this. Something I've always turned off because I found distracting, particularly with my Sony cameras, and with this camera I like what it does. It's real subtle, just helpful. Focus points used, again, I told you I put that setting here in my menu so I can flip to having all of them available if I want. flash sync shutter speed. So you can change that around to the flash synchronization, or the shutter speed it's going to allow the camera to drop to when you're doing flash photography. So I often like 1/60th when I'm doing event photography with a flash in the hot shoe and TTL. It just kind of sets a base shutter speed to make sure I'm freezing motion, but you can change that around and set it up however you want. Once again, flash control, that just lets me control those off-camera flashes. Non-CPU lens data, this is an interesting one. This is for if you're using old legacy Nikon lenses and glass, and so, or and it allows it to meter older Nikon lenses that don't have the electronic hookups, as long as you tell it what's attached. So I have an old 400mm 3.5 manual focus, beautiful lens that I love to do video with, that I just have to tell it that that's on there. If I put the doubler on it, it becomes an 800 7.1, so I tell it it's lens number 2 that's on there. So that's easily set up. You just have to remember to tell it that. If you want to add an item to my menu, the way that you do that is you just run down. Let's say we want to go into custom settings and put something on from timers and AE lock, and let's say we wanted to put the power off delay in, and I can literally move it around in the stack, place it wherever I want. Let's put it at the bottom, and then I'll show you how to get rid of it. So I'll put under non-CPU lens data. Now if I want to remove an item, same thing. I can just go to the bottom of the stack. I went up instead of scrolling down through them all. And I click to the right to check it. I click OK, and I say, yes, I want to get rid of that. You can move them around with ranking items. All you have to do is click on the item and then move it to where you want in the stack. I'm going to leave it where it is, but if you clicked OK again, it would move it to that location. Real simple stuff. It's a really, really nice camera that it's so customizable, and I think there are a few customizations that can actually help with some of its complications. Like I think setting the OK button to always zoom into 100% and then take you back to the full frame view of the scene is really, really helpful because you don't have that ability to touch the manual focus ring and automatically zoom into your focus point. Hopefully Nikon will change that in firmware. And there's a couple other tips I'll give you. One is if you're really struggling with that depth of field problem in landscape photography and you don't want to hold the depth of field preview button down to see what's going on from a depth of field perspective, be at a smaller aperture than f5.6, you can flip to video mode, and video mode always shows you exactly the correct aperture that you've chosen, and you can preview your scene and change your focus around and get it to where everything's in focus at the aperture that you want, and then flip back to still photography mode. Now the pain in the butt of it is it isn't going to lock in the settings that you set up in video mode, so you're going to have to select that same aperture. But the good news is that even with a focus by wire lens like this, an electronically focusing lens, it doesn't change the focus when you flip it from video to still mode. It does when you turn the camera off and turn it back on or switch the battery, but not flipping between modes. It leaves the focus set, which is nice. Good job, Nikon, with that. It's a little bit of a podunk way around that. I would much rather let them at least have me choose that when I touch depth of field preview, it will lock open or lock down, and then I'd have to push it again to open it back up. That would be nice. Maybe they can do that in firmware. And lastly, I want to talk about some of the accessories that I'd really recommend that you consider whether you're getting the Z6 or the Z7. One is a good L bracket, and I know that I've heard some of the problems that happen with the FTC adapter, FTZ adapter, that people have problems with different L brackets. That that little gap that's right between the foot on the FTZ adapter and some of the L brackets out there makes it really hard to get into different clamps, Arca Swiss clamps. And so I have a whole bunch of tripods in here, different clamps on a number of them, and I've had no problem dropping in any direction that I want with Kirk Enterprise Solutions L bracket. Now, in all honesty and disclosure, I'm an ambassador for them because I really love their products and they're great people to work with. I like the fact that they integrate the Allen wrench, in there. They're not the only ones to do that, but they do a nice job of it. It's all really well machined, and again, they're great people and they really dialed that guy in there nicely. They've also made an L bracket for the FTZ adapter. For myself, most of the lenses that I would adapt onto this, they're longer lenses, have rotating collars with feet, so I don't see a huge need for an L bracket on the FTZ adapter myself. But I could see the application out there where you've got a heavy lens that doesn't have a lens foot, and you want to balance the camera behind the FTZ adapter on the tripod and the lens in front. So having that L bracket could be handy. They make that if you're curious or want one of those. I think that the 24-70 lens, that's basically the kit lens that came out with the Z6 and the Z7, is really astounding in its edge-to-edge sharpness, particularly when it's wide open at f4. Just a really, really beautiful lens. It's very well balanced to this camera, just the right size. You can get wider open aperture lenses. You can adapt your other Nikon glass. Most people who are coming to this camera system probably have a closet full of Nikon glass. It adapts really well through the FTZ adapter. So definitely the FTZ adapter is a must. I think the 24-70 is something that you'll be really pleased with if you have it. And that's basically the accessories that I have for there. You know, some extra batteries. The batteries, you know, I don't find the battery life to be nearly as bad as the SEPA rating would indicate. But then again, I use the viewfinder more than the live view on the back. I think that it's comparable to my D500 or my D850 when I'm using live view in the field. You know, obviously I can get more shots out of them when I'm not using live view and I'm just using the optical system because there's so much less energy used. I think it does really well for a mirrorless. It's right up there, I think, with the newer Sonys that I've used and the experiences I've had with them. Right in that same kind of ballpark. They're getting better. Everything's kind of getting better with mirrorless. You know, I would say overall my experience with mirrorless versus DSLR at this point is that, you know, DSLR is really at the pinnacle of design innovation. It's been around since the film days. It's come through all the digital revolution and had so many different models that they've been refining and refining and refining. They've got autofocus style. They've got all these settings dialed. They have the ergonomics of it all set up. Mirrorless is a brand new ballgame, and Nikon's brought a lot of their design and performance understanding from DSLRs into this mirrorless offering and done a really nice job out of the box. I'm sure that in subsequent versions, when we have the next models coming out, autofocus is going to improve dramatically, and they'll just get better and better and better. And I have no doubt the way that technology advances, moving everything to the sensor makes sense. The ability to track faces, to track eyes, to do things that the computer's just watching what it's seeing in the sensor is going to surpass what we could do with optical systems, without a doubt. And they're getting smaller and lighter and more energy efficient. So it's a really exciting time. I'm finding this camera to be a real fun, high quality machine that makes a lot of sense for me because of its better video quality than any other Nikon camera I've used, its incredible low light ability, and its size and its weight. So hopefully this video helped a little bit for those of you setting a camera like this up. If you liked it, please click like, please click subscribe. If you have comments to make, things to add on, things to dispute, you know, throw them down in the YouTube comments. I love that conversation. And speaking of conversations, I have a weekly series of videos called Approaching the Scene. This week, we're talking with my good friend, the amazing filmmaker, Andy Adkins, about how this camera translates for a filmmaker. You know, is it up to snuff? How's it compared to other cameras that he's used for dedicated filmmaking? And it's an interesting conversation, so go ahead and check that out. And again, if you have any questions, you don't want to leave them in the public comments, send them to questions@hudsonhenry.com. I respond to those, and sometimes I throw them up in the Approaching the Scene series if they're a good universal question that applies to everyone. So thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.